Hello, and welcome to another episode of Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and this is your weekly look into the English language libraries of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X, where I have a goal of doing a deep dive review into each and every one of these games, including looks at the actual packaging and gameplay footage recorded on original hardware whenever possible. And yeah, I still haven't figured out what I'm going to do for those Master System 3D games, but I'll figure out something, I think. Anyway, in doing this channel, one of the things that's been a very nice byproduct of doing these videos is actually getting feedback from you, the viewers. Now, when I started the channel, I never really had any intention of it being any big thing, and don't get me wrong, I know it's still not. But the whole point is, I really just wanted to do these reviews so that the material was out there. And if people watched, cool. But that was never really my major motivation. It really has always been more about the games. However, having said that, it's really nice to know that there's people out there that support me and the channel and that actually pay attention and discuss the games and videos down in the comments or on Twitter. And this week's game choice and review is a direct result of those comments. Now, I'd say I have about 50% of the schedule laid out for the next few years, and then of course I'm still missing quite a few games from the collection, so this doesn't always work out. But I had someone suggest that I take a look at this week's game, PowerMonger for the Genesis. And to the person that suggested that, definitely identify yourself down in the comments if you see this. I apologize, but I don't remember who it was right now, or else I'd shout you out. You see, I'm kind of old. The brain doesn't exactly work too good anymore. Just don't tell the people I work for. You know. Anyway, in this case, it worked out, as I do, in fact, already have a copy of PowerMonger, and I hadn't played a strategy game yet this year, so this is as good as any to try and figure out exactly what PowerMonger is. Well, one thing that I do know is that the title is all one word, which is kind of weird. I mean, it's clearly two words. But Bullfrog Productions, developers of PowerMonger, decided to stylize it as all being run together, even though the M in Monger is capitalized. Whatever. I'm really only mentioning it because I know for a fact last week, when I was reviewing Toe Jam and Earl Panic on Funkatron, I referred to Toe Jam as two words rather than just one, and it wasn't until after I was done with the edit that I figured out that it wasn't right. Oops. The Genesis Mega Drive version of PowerMonger was released in March of 1993 simultaneously in the United States and Europe, and then popped up a few months later in Japan. In a release that might seem a little surprising, just due to the amount of text that would have to be translated to create a Japanese version of the game, but those assets were probably able to be taken from one of the other previous Japanese versions of the game, as technically PowerMonger had already been released in the country for three other devices, the PC-98, the Sharp X68000, and the FM Towns. But none of those were the original version of the game. Oh no, for that we have to go all the way back to 1990, with the game originally being developed by Bullfrog for the Amiga and the Atari ST. But none of the other 8-bit usual suspects, and I think you'll be able to see why in just a little bit. But for now, let's go ahead and take a closer look at the PowerMonger package and get a closer look at what I'm getting myself into. And this is my copy of PowerMonger for the Genesis. And you can probably immediately see that this copy has seen better days, at least on the outside. The case itself is actually in good shape, and other than a few small divots on the front, is fully intact, keeping in mind that the Electronic Arts boxes never had hang tabs to worry about. Also, it should be noted that this is from the wide box era, so this case is slightly wider than your usual clamshell, and if you get a copy of the game and it's not in a wide box, there might have been some chicanery going on. While the case itself has held up well, unfortunately the inner cover has taken a bit of damage. The inner cover clearly took on some water at some point and has some water wrinkling to not just the front, but also the spine and the rear as well, so it must have really gotten soaked. I've seen where people have attempted to press things like this out by putting the paper between two heavy weights, and maybe that's something I would try someday, but for now, it is what it is. Thankfully, even though the cover took on all that water, it doesn't appear to have affected the print in any way, and all of the art is still intact and looks similar to how it looked new. If the cover being wrinkled annoyed me that much, I'm sure I could find a replacement easy enough, as complete copies are only going for about $20 right now on price charting, but right now I'm not worried about it.
As far as the actual cover art goes, I think it looks fantastic. If you've never seen any of the other versions of it, that is. It utilizes the old Electronic Arts half and half formatting, with the art showing what appears to be your PowerMonger character on the inside at the top, and then the logo down below. And honestly, I can't imagine them doing any better than this while using that formatting. The logo, the colors, and the art all pop off the page. However, I think in this case I actually prefer the artwork on the European version, which is a only very slightly altered version of the Amiga original. And when you can see the whole picture, it actually appears that the one-eyed character at the top is potentially one of your rivals, and your character is instead depicted by the hands at the bottom that are attempting to rip the world apart. Both are good efforts, and I also appreciate the Japanese version for trying to pull off a mix of the two. But when you see the artwork as it was originally intended, there's just no competing with that. Flipping over the back, and oh, well, here's some of that art that's missing from the front. Nice of them to still work that in some manner, I guess. I love this tagline at the top. In a world without kings, power is the only law. Super dramatic and really gets you interested in wanting to play the game. Even with the overlap screenshots, I like this layout a lot, and I don't think I've seen one quite like it before. All the screenshots are of good quality, and honestly might make the game look a bit better than it really does. And the minimal flavor text does a good job at selling the game without being too wordy. Opening the case up, and there's the manual and the cartridge in decent condition, and you can tell the manual has been looked at a time or two. And for good reason, because like a lot of early EA titles, this is a book of a manual, weighing in at 80 pages, larger than even most other EA manuals at the time that would usually come in around 64. There's good reason for that though, because the manual not only fully explains the game, which has a lot going on, but also has a 16-page section to walk you through the first game area, as a tutorial of sorts. Now, I know not all games are as complex as PowerMonger, but this is why manuals are great. And if you're going to sit down and play PowerMonger, I strongly recommend getting a copy with the manual. Okay, that's the package. Now let's get into the game and see what all this mongering of power is all about. Before I get too far, eagle-eyed viewers probably noticed the blue diamond on the rear cover of the PowerMonger that stated from the designers of Populous. So I should probably go ahead and mention that Populous, like PowerMonger, is a game from Bullfrog Productions and came from the mind of the same lead designer, Peter Molyneux, who you've probably heard of over the years, as he is also one of the primary minds behind Dungeon Keeper, Theme Park, and the Fable games. But his design career started with Populous. And if I'm being honest, I probably should have reviewed Populous for the Genesis before PowerMonger since it came first, but I've got a copy of PowerMonger and I don't have a copy of Populous yet, so I'll just have to circle back to it. Just from what I know of Populous, as I haven't actually played it, it basically serves as a god game, where you are essentially a god of a people and you control the people's progression in a fight to dominate another people that don't worship you, via an isometric view of the land that is being fought over. Populous differs from a strategy game like Civilization by having many smaller levels with different layouts, rather than instead having one large map to conquer all at once. And it was successful enough to eventually have a sequel called Populous 2, Trials of the Olympian Gods, or as it was known on the Mega Drive, Two Tribes Populous 2. But between Populous and Populous 2, there was PowerMonger. And now I'm really thinking I should have reviewed Populous first. Oh well. Anyway, PowerMonger is similar in concept to Populous, but with a few very notable tweaks. First, while Populous had an ancient primitive theme to it, harkening back to the days of multi-theistic societies like Greece and Egypt, PowerMonger updates the setting to medieval times and feudal society, where different areas were frequently not united under one central ruler, and instead serving someone who was geographically closer to them. Along with the changes to the setting, PowerMonger also went with an inventive 3D layout to the game action. If you've played Populous, you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, didn't Populous have a 3D engine? And it did, sort of. In Populous, part of your job as being a deity was to literally reshape the world, similar to SimCity, and this involved flattening mountains if they were in your way, or perhaps even digging down and lowering the elevation in an area. and this was all displayed via a locked isometric view. Where PowerMonger differs is that the maps are set at the start of a level, and rather than have the level displayed in that locked isometric view, the map is displayed via a camera angle above the action, and that camera angle can be zoomed in and out and rotated 360 degrees in 12-hour increments, with the hours representing the angle on a clock face. I like what they were going for here, as the levels do appear to be a true 3D model, with many varying raises and falls to the geography in the maps. There's just a few problems with the implementation. First, keep in mind that this game is being played on a Genesis, which was never intended to display 3D graphics. Just in the course of doing this channel, I've reviewed games like Hard Drivin' and LHX Attack Chopper, and while those games ran, they didn't exactly run well. And if you've seen those videos, you know what I'm talking about. To combat this, like in Populous, your view of the current area of the map is actually very small, only taking up about a quarter of the window, while the rest of the area is primarily used for different display windows. This smaller window makes it easier on the Genesis to attempt to display the 3D environment, as there's fewer objects that need to be animated, similar to how the Sega CD full motion video sequences would usually just be a portion of the screen rather than full screen. Unfortunately, even with the smaller on-screen area to be rendered, the game still runs pretty rough. Part of that is due to the amount of people and other creatures that have to be drawn, and the game does run a bit better when there's less going on screen, as you would imagine. But that's not particularly helpful when you're in the middle of a big battle and you're trying to move the screen around or zoom in and out to get a better view of the action, so that you can plan your next move. There were several times when I was playing the game where the camera simply would refuse to reposition while combat was going on, and I was stuck having to wait for things to calm down before moving on to the next thing, which is kind of a problem in a game that specifically runs in real time. Along with the animation issues I just mentioned, some of the camera angles simply just don't work well. I love the fact that the game maps feel like they have realistic depictions of both hills and bodies of water, and that each map I played definitely has a unique feel to it. But when you have an environment that features some pretty drastic elevation changes, the camera needs to be able to view enough of the environment so that you don't end up with a view that appears to be half buried, obscuring what's going on. This happens all too often in PowerMonger, and there's nothing more frustrating than trying to scan over an area to try to get a better look at it while knowing you're on the clock, and not being able to see anything because a mountain is in the way. Technically, the answer to this is that you can temporarily spin the orientation of the camera left and right to get a non-obscured view of the action, but this ends up not being very useful, as the game engine is designed for being viewed at that 11 o'clock orientation, and if you don't view from that angle, moving around the map can become very disorienting. Outside the land display area of the screen, there are some other issues with the gameplay in general, as it pertains to how the various other sections of the screen are laid out. Essentially, there's 4 other boxes that are used during gameplay. There's the bottom text box, which does pretty much what it says, and displays text about what's going on, and also doubles as the box that's used when you want to use the pointer on the in-game map area when you need to select things. Then there's also the box that displays the scales of how you're doing in taking over the level, and doubles as the box that's used for when you need to move the camera around. And then there's the mini-map box, which can be used to target areas of the map without actually having to view that area directly. Finally, there's the command box on the right side of the screen, which is what you use to actually tell your captains what to do. Upon hearing all that, you're probably wondering what the problem is, because without actually playing the game, it appears to be neatly organized. Well, the issue comes down to how you end up navigating those boxes. The text box and the 2 boxes on the left are toggled between by hitting the B button, and you can't go straight to any of them. You have to hit the B button however many times you need to get to the box that you want. And all of that is only if you haven't hit the C button to toggle to the command box, because if you're in that box, hitting B just gives you a description of the command that's highlighted, rather than switching back to the box that you're in, which instead requires you to hit the C button to snap back. You get used to it after a while, certainly, but even after I'd played the game for a few hours, I still found myself occasionally hitting the wrong button, and it combined with these slow gameplay map animations just never feels great, and always seems a bit awkward. Now, I should probably point out that, like I mentioned in the intro, this game was originally designed for the Amiga and the Atari ST, and of course both of those have mouse functionality, not to mention that they are better equipped for displaying software-rendered 3D graphics, so it makes sense that the game simply isn't going to work as well on the Genesis under those constraints. However, to add insult to injury, the game was ported to the Super Nintendo at the same time, and the team that ported that version of the game retained the mouse controls for the full screen, and it just leaves you scratching your head as to why they couldn't have just done that for the Genesis version as well. It doesn't totally ruin the game, but it does make things much more laborious, and it simply didn't need to be that way. I haven't talked much about the specifics of what you're actually doing in PowerMonger so far, so I should probably get to that. In PowerMonger, you're given a world map that consists of 195 different lands in a 13 by 15 grid. Your goal is to conquer your way from the northwest corner of the map to the southeast corner, in any order you choose. You don't have to conquer all 195 lands to make your way to the goal, but you certainly can if you want to. I really like the freedom here, in that you can play the game however you want, and say if you find a particular area on the map to be too difficult, you can simply go around it, as long as you make it to that last piece. What I also like is how insanely detailed the game is. Now, as a caveat, most of this is randomly generated when a land is loaded, and you can quickly tell this because the names of the towns and the people often don't resemble standard names. But every town on the map you're playing has a unique name, and all of the people on the maps not only have their own names, but their own backgrounds and ages as well, in an attempt to make the game feel more lifelike. Again, it's all randomly generated, but the fact that you can click on an individual person on the map and have them not just be NPC number 27 is pretty crazy stuff, especially for a console game in 1993. Along with all that, the game is most definitely a strategy game, and it doesn't just consist of deciding how to geographically take over an area. You also have to determine just how aggressive you are at fighting battles, because you probably need some of those guys to not just be slaughtered, so that you can refill your own ranks or create new weapons. And then conversely, you don't want to create too large of an army, because then you run the risk of running out of food before you can conquer the countryside. At first, the game seems pretty complex, and it is. I think it's probably easier to get started with something like Warcraft, but once you've played a few rounds and get the basics down, you can start getting into the more advanced techniques, like trading and possibly forming alliances, or utilizing more than one captain at a time. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is the sound, and honestly, there's not a ton to mention. The only music present is during the intro, and then when you either win or lose a round. The music itself is fine, but since you're going to be spending 98% of the game in actual gameplay, it's impossible to view it as anything but an afterthought. What you end up hearing most of the time during the game is various sound effects, which consist of a lot of metal clashing during fights, but also some lumber sawing and, oddly, a lot of bird noises. Granted, part of that is because one of the zanier game mechanics is the use of carrier pigeons to send orders between captains, and you can actually attempt to kill the pigeons to disrupt enemy communications, but good luck actually pulling that off in this version of the game. The sound effects are okay, and I'd say they're on par with the Amiga version, but definitely a step down from the Atari ST, which actually sounds pretty cool in comparison. All in all, PowerMonger isn't a game that I like, necessarily, but it's a game that I respect. Real-time strategy games are not my favorite genre, to be sure, so PowerMonger was always going to be fighting an uphill battle here. And the somewhat poor graphics performance on the console, combined with the, at best, awkward menu implementation, is not how you're going to get me interested in one of these games. But I do really appreciate the game design, and I'm kind of blown away that a game like this is even possible on the Genesis, with the Genesis version appearing a year and a half before the original Warcraft would be released on PC, just to give you an idea of the time period. I genuinely had fun trying out PowerMonger this week, but this isn't a game that I can see myself playing long term, and due to that and the litany of issues that I mentioned, I'm giving PowerMonger on the Genesis 2 stars. Having said that, though, if you're an RTS fan, I think PowerMonger is definitely a game that you should check out if you haven't already. just maybe not this particular version.
Okay, and that was PowerMonger on the Genesis. I want to be clear, I didn't hate it, and I was genuinely impressed by certain aspects of the game, but the awkwardness of the controls was a bit hard to overcome. And to its credit, its password continue system was nice and simple, and I always appreciate that. If you're going to do passwords instead of battery backup, it can't be a million characters. What probably doesn't have a password system is the Sega CD version, which I'll be looking at in another 100 episodes or so. I say probably though because while I've got a copy of it, I know nothing about it, and I specifically didn't look up information about it when I was doing this review so that I could be surprised when I got to it. We shall see. Next time on Zilog and Moto, well, I did it again. Just like how I previously was supposed to review Pac-Mania but didn't have a copy of it, now I was supposed to review Winter Olympic Games for the Master System and didn't order it. Yeah, I know, lame. But I've actually got it written down to pick up both of those this week, so those reviews are coming. But for the next review, it's time to go back to the unholy arcade union of Tetris and strategy. I'm curious if I'll like it any better this time, but I wouldn't get your hopes up. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 196. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.